in the evening, as the emperor and I were walking together in the lower path, which had now become the favorite resort, I informed him that a person of consequence whose ideas and statements might become the channel of mediation between ourselves and the ruling world and influence our future destiny had, with sufficiently significant forms and preambles, invited us to tell him conscientiously what we believed to be the emperor's notions on certain political subjects. Whether he had granted his last constitution with the intention of maintaining it, whether he had sincerely abandoned his former plans as to the great empire, whether he would consent to leave England in the enjoyment of her maritime supremacy without envying her the tranquil possession of India, whether he would be willing to renounce the colonies and to purchase colonial goods from the English alone at the regular market price, whether he would not form an alliance with the Americans in case of their rupture with England, whether he would consent to the existence of a great kingdom of Germany for the branch of the English royal family, which must immediately forfeit the throne of Great Britain on the accession of the Princess Charlotte of Wales, or in default of Germany, whether he would consent to the establishment of that dominion in Portugal, in case England should conclude arrangements to that effect at the court of Brazil. These questions did not rest on vague ideas or idle opinions. The individual supported them on positive facts. We want, said he, a long and lasting peace on the continent. We want the tranquil enjoyment of our present advantages to help us out of the critical circumstances in which we are now involved and to relieve us from the enormous debt with which we are burdened. The present state of France and of Europe, added he, cannot bring about these results. The victory of Waterloo has ruined you. But it was far from saving us. Every sensible man in England, every one who escapes the momentary influence of passion, either does think or will think as I do. The emperor doubted a part of this statement and treated the rest as a reverie. Then, changing his tone, he said to me, "Well, what is your opinion?" "Come, sir, you are now in the Council of State." "Sire," I replied, "people often indulged in reveries on the most serious subjects, and our being imprisoned at St. Helena does not hinder us from composing romances. Here then is one. Why not form a political marriage between the two nations, in which the one would bring the army as a dowry and the other the navy? This will doubtless appear an absurd idea in the eyes of the vulgar, and will perhaps be thought too bold by well-informed people, because it is entirely novel and out of the usual routine. But it is one of those unforeseen, luminous, and useful creations of plans which characterize your majesty. You alone can cause it to be listened to and carried into effect. Going even beyond the ideas of our English interlocutor, I said, would not your majesty give tomorrow, if you could, the whole French navy to purchase Belgium and the bank of the Rhine? Would you not give 150 millions to purchase tens of thousands of millions? Besides, such a bargain would procure to both nations at once the object for which they have been wrangling and fighting for so many years. It would reduce both countries to the necessity of mutually assisting each other instead of maintaining perpetual enmity. Would it be nothing for France that her merchants in the English colonies should henceforward be on the footing of Englishmen, and thus secure, without striking a blow, the enjoyment of the trade of the whole world? Would it not be everything for England, on the other hand, for the sake of ensuring herself the sovereignty of the ocean, the universality of trade for obtaining and preserving, which she has incurred so many risks to attach France to a system by which the latter would become the regulator and arbiter of the continent, henceforth secure from danger and strengthened by all the power of her ally? England might disband her army in return for the sacrifice which France would make of her navy. She might even reduce considerably the number of her ships. She would thus pay her debt, relieve her people, and prosper. And far from envying France, she would, the system being once fairly understood, and passion having given place to real interests, herself labor for the continental aggrandizement of her neighbor. For France would then be merely the advance guard, while England would be the resource and the reserve. Unity of legislation between the two nations, their common interests, results so visibly advantageous, would make amends for all the obstacles and difficulties which the passions of rulers might oppose to the fulfillment of this plan. The emperor heard me, but made no reply. It is seldom that one can ascertain his private opinions, and he rarely enters into political conversations. Lest I should not have expressed myself with sufficient clearness, I requested that he would permit me to unfold my ideas in writing. He consented and said no more. It was now very late, and he retired to rest. The 8th. The emperor dictated in the garden to Messieurs Montholon and Gourgaud, and then walked on his favorite path. He was fatigued and indisposed. He observed some females about to advance on the path and to throw themselves awkwardly in his way for the sake of being introduced to him. This annoyed him, and he turned away to avoid meeting them. I suggested that riding on horseback might be beneficial to him. We had 3 horses at our disposal. The emperor replied that he never could reconcile himself to the idea of having an English officer constantly decide that he decidedly renounced riding on such conditions, adding that everything in life must be reduced to calculation, and that if the vexation arising from the sight of his jailer were greater than the advantage he might derive from riding, it was of course advisable to renounce the recreation altogether. The emperor ate but little dinner. During the dessert he amused himself in examining the paintings on some plates of very beautiful Sèvres porcelain. They were chef d'oeuvre of their kind and were worthy of 30 Napoleons each. The paintings represented views or objects of antiquity in Egypt. The emperor closed the day with a walk in his favorite path. He remarked that he had been very dull all day. After several broken conversations, he looked at his watch and was very glad to find it was 10:30. The weather was delicious, and the emperor insensibly recovered his usual spirits. He complained of his constitution, which, though vigorous, occasionally exposed him to fits of indisposition. He, however, consoled himself with the thought that if, in imitation of the ancients, he should ever feel inclined to escape from the disgusts and vexations of life, his moral opinions were not of a nature to prevent him. He said that sometimes he could not reflect without horror on the many years he might still have to live, and on the inutility of a protracted old age, and that if he were convinced France was happy and tranquil and not needing his aid, he should have lived long enough. We ascended to the pavilion. It was past midnight, and we thought we had gained a signal victory over time. The 9th. I called on Mr. Balcombe very early to deliver to him my letters for Europe. As the vessel was on the point of sailing, at Mr. Balcombe's house, I met the officer who had been appointed as our guard. Struck with the dejection which I had observed in the emperor the day before, and convinced of the necessity of his taking exercise, I told the officer that I suspected the reason which prevented the emperor from riding on horseback. I added that I would speak to him the more candidly and openly, since I had noticed the very delicate way in which he discharged his duty. I inquired what were his instructions and whether it would be necessary to observe them literally in case the emperor merely took a ride round the house, adverting to the repugnance which he must naturally feel for arrangements that were calculated every moment to revive the recollection of the situation in which he was placed. I assured the officer that no reflections were intended to be cast on him personally, and that I was convinced when the emperor wished to take long rides, he would prefer having him to accompany him. The officer replied that his instructions were to follow the emperor, but that as he made it a rule not to do anything that might be offensive to him, he would take upon himself not to accompany him. At breakfast, I communicated to the emperor the conversation I had had with the captain. He replied that it was all well meant on the captain's part, but that he should not avail himself of the indulgence, as it was not conformable with his sentiments to enjoy an advantage which might be the means of compromising an officer. This determination was very fortunate. When I went to Mr. Balcombe's in the evening, the captain took me aside to inform me that he had been to the town in the course of the day to speak with the admiral respecting our morning's conversation, and that he had been enjoined to abide by his instructions. I could not refrain from replying somewhat sharply that I was certain the emperor would immediately send back the 3 horses that had been assigned for his use. The officer, to whom I had also communicated the reply which the emperor had given me in the morning relative to him, observed that it would be very right to send back the horses, and that he thought nothing better could be done. This remark appeared to me to be prompted by the mortification he himself experienced at the part that was imposed on him. When we left Mr. Balcomb's, the emperor walked up and down the path in the garden. I mentioned to him what I had heard from the English officer. He seemed to expect it. I was not deceived in my conjecture. He ordered me to send away the horses. This vexed me exceedingly, and I said, perhaps rather sharply, that with his leave I would go and fulfill his orders immediately, on which he replied with great gravity and in a very peculiar tone of voice, "No, sir, you are now out of temper. It rarely happens that anything is done well under such circumstances. It is always best to let the night pass over after the offense of the day." We continued our walk till nearly midnight. The weather was delightful. The 10th today, when our usual task was ended, the emperor strolled out in a new direction. He proceeded towards the town until he came within sight of the road and the shipping. As he was returning, he met Mrs. Balcombe and Mrs. Stewart, a very pretty woman about 20 years of age, who was returning from Bombay to England. The emperor conversed with her respecting the manners and customs of India and the inconveniences of a sea voyage, particularly for females. He also spoke of Scotland, which was Mrs. Stewart's native country, said a great deal about Ossian, and complimented the lady on the climate of India not having spoiled her clear Scottish complexion. At this moment, some slaves carrying heavy boxes passed us on the road. Mrs. Balcombe desired them in a rather angry tone to keep back, but the emperor interfered, saying, "Respect the burden, madam." At these words, Mrs. Stewart, who had been attentively observing the emperor's features, said in a low tone of voice to her friend, "Heavens! What a countenance! And what a character! How different from what I had been led to expect!" No kidding. The 11th to the 13th, we led a most regular life at Briars. Every day after dictating to me, the emperor walked out between 3 and 4 o'clock. He descended to the garden, where he walked up and down and dictated to one of the gentlemen who came from the town for that purpose and who wrote in the little arbor. About 5:30 o'clock, he passed Mr. Balcomb's house and went into the lower walk, to which he became every day more and more attached. At this time, the family were at dinner, and he could enjoy his promenade without interruption. I joined the emperor here, and he continued his walk until dinner was announced. After dinner, the emperor again returned to the garden, where he sometimes had his coffee brought to him. My son then visited Mr. Balcomb's family, and the emperor and I walked up and down. We frequently remained in the garden until the night was far advanced and the moon rose to light us. In the mildness and serenity of the night, we forgot the burning heat of the day. The emperor never was more talkative, nor seemed more perfectly to forget his cares than during these moonlit walks. In the familiarity of the conversations which I thus enjoyed with him, he took pleasure in relating anecdotes of his boyhood, in describing the sentiments and illusions which diffused a charm over the early years of his youth, and in detailing the circumstances of his private life, since he had played so distinguished a part on the great theater of the world. I have elsewhere noted down what I conceived myself at liberty to repeat. Sometimes he seemed to think he had spoken too much at length and had detailed things too minutely. He would then say to me, "Come, it's your turn now. Let me have a little of your history. But you are not a tale-teller." Indeed, I took especial care to be silent. I was too much afraid of losing a syllable of what was so deeply interesting to me. In one of our nightly walks, the emperor told me that he had, in the course of his life, been attached to 2 women of very different characters. The one was the votary of art and graces. The other was all innocence and simple nature, and each, he observed, had a very high degree of merit. The first, in no moment of her life, ever assumed a position or attitude that was not pleasing or captivating. It would have been impossible ever to discover in her, or to experience from her, anything unpleasant. She employed every resource of art to heighten natural attractions, but with such ingenuity as to render every trace of it imperceptible. The other, on the contrary, never suspected that anything was to be gained by innocent artifice. He wishes. The one was always besides the truth. Her first answer was always in the negative. The other was altogether frank and open, and was a stranger to subterfuge. The first never asked her husband for anything, but he was in debt to everyone. The second freely asked whenever she wanted, which, however, was very seldom. and she never thought of receiving anything without immediately paying for it. Both were amiable and gentle in disposition and strongly attached to their husband, but it must already, having guessed who they are, and those who have ever seen them will not fail to recognize the two empresses. The emperor declared that he had uniformly experienced from both the great equality of temper and a most implicit obedience. The marriage of Maria Louisa was consummated at Fontainebleau immediately after her arrival. The emperor, setting aside all the etiquette that had previously been arranged, went to meet her, and in disguise got into her carriage. She was agreeably surprised when she discovered him. She had always been given to understand that Berthier, who had married her by proxy at Vienna in person and age, exactly resembled the emperor. She, however, signified that she observed a very pleasing difference between them. The emperor wished to spare her all the details of domestic etiquette customary on such occasions. She had, however, received careful instruction on the subject at Vienna. The emperor inquired what direction she had received from her illustrious relatives with regard to him personally. To be entirely devoted to him and to obey him on all things, was the reply. This declaration, and not the decisions of certain cardinals and bishops, as was reported, proved the solution of all the emperor's scruples of conscience. Besides, Henry IV acted in the same way on a similar occasion. Maria Louisa's marriage, said the emperor, was proposed and concluded under the same forms and conditions as that of Marie Antoinette, whose contract was adopted as a model. After the separation from Josephine, negotiations were entered into with the Emperor of Russia for the purpose of soliciting the hand of one of his sisters, and difficulties rested merely on the settling of certain points relative to religion. Prince Eugene, conversing with M. de Schwarzenberg, learned that the Emperor of Austria would not object to a union between Napoleon and his daughter, and this information was communicated to the emperor. A council was convoked to decide whether an alliance with Russia or Austria would be most advantageous. Eugene and Talleyrand were for the Austrian alliance, and Cambacérès against it. The majority were in favor of an archduchess. Eugene was appointed to make the official overture, and the Minister for Foreign Affairs was empowered to sign it that very day if an opportunity should present itself, which proved to be the case. Russia took umbrage at this. She thought herself trifled with, though without just ground. Nothing of an obligatory nature had yet transpired. Both parties remained perfectly free. Political interest predominated over everything. The emperor appointed the Duchess de Montebello to be the lady of honor to Maria Louisa, the Count de Beauharnais to be her gentleman of honor, and the Prince Aldobrandini to be her equerry. In the misfortunes of 1814, these individuals, said the emperor, did not evince the devotedness which the empress was entitled to expect from them. Her equerry deserted her without taking his leave. Her gentleman of honor refused to follow her, and her lady of honor, notwithstanding the attachment which the empress entertained for her, thought she had completely fulfilled her duty in attending her mistress as far as Vienna. The appointment of the Duchess de Montebello to the post of Lady of Honor was one of those happy selections which at the time was made, excited universal approbation. The Duchess was a young and beautiful woman of irreproachable character, and the widow of a marshal called the Orlando of the army, who had recently fallen on the field of battle. This choice was very agreeable to the army and encouraged the National Party, who were alarmed at the marriage and the number and rank of the chamberlains who were appointed. The retinue was by many looked upon as a step towards the counter-revolution, and endeavors were made to represent it as such. As for the emperor, he had acted in ignorance of the character of Maria Louisa, and had been principally influenced by the fear that she would be filled with prejudices respecting birth that might be offensive at the court. When he came to know her better and found that she was wholly imbued with the prevailing notions of the day, he regretted not having made another choice. He conceived that he would have been better served by the Countess de Beauvau, a woman of amiable, mild, and inoffensive manners, who would have been influenced only by the family advice of her numerous relatives, and who might thus have introduced a kind of useful custom and have occasion the appointment of well-recommended inferiors. She might also have rallied about the court many persons who were at a distance, and that without any inconvenience, because these arrangements could only have been brought about by the sanction of the emperor, who was not the sort of man to allow himself to be abused. The empress conceived a tenderest affection for the Duchess de Montebello. This lady had at one time a chance of being Queen of Spain. Ferdinand VII, when at Valenciennes, requested the empress permission to marry Mademoiselle de Tascher, cousin german of Josephine, and bearing the same name after the example of the Princess of Baden, who married Mademoiselle de Beauharnais, the emperor, who already contemplated a separation from Josephine, refused his consent to the match, not wishing, by this connection, to add to the difficulties that already stood in the way of his divorce. Ferdinand then solicited the hand of the Duchess de Montebello, or of any other French lady whom the emperor might think proper to adopt. The emperor subsequently gave Mademoiselle de Tascher in marriage to the Duke d'Arenberg, whom he intended to create governor of the Netherlands, with the view of ultimately compensating Brussels for the loss of the old court. The emperor, moreover, wished to appoint the Count de Narbonne, who had taken part in the empress's marriage, gentleman of honor and room of the Count de Beauharnais. But the extreme aversion which Maria Louisa evinced for this change deterred the emperor from carrying it into effect. The empress's dislike to the Count de Narbonne was, however, only occasioned by the intrigues of the individuals composing her household, who had nothing to fear from Monsieur de Beauharnais, but who very much dreaded the influence and talent of Monsieur de Narbonne. The emperor informed us that when he had to make appointments to difficult posts, he usually asked the persons about him to furnish him with a list of candidates. And from these lists, the information he obtained, he privately deliberated on his choice. He mentioned several individuals who were proposed as lady of honor to the empress. They were the Princess de Vaudemont, Madame de Rochefoucauld, afterwards Madame de Castellana, and some others. He then asked us to tell him whom we should have proposed, which occasioned us to take a review of a good part of the court. One of us mentioned Madame de Montesquieu, upon which the emperor replied she would have done well, but she had a post which suited her still better. She was a woman of singular merit. Her piety was sincere, and her principles excellent. She had the highest claims to my esteem and regard. I wanted half a dozen like her. I would have given them all appointments equal to the deserts, and wished for more. She discharged her duties admirably. When with my son at Vienna, the following anecdote will afford a correct idea of the manner in which Madame de Montesquieu managed the King of Rome. The apartments of the young prince were on the ground floor and looked out on the court of the Tuileries. At almost every hour in the day, numbers of people were looking in at the window in the hope of seeing him. One day he was in a violent fit of passion and rebelling furiously against the authority of Madame de Montesquieu. She immediately ordered all the shutters to be closed. The child, surprised at the sudden darkness, asked Maman Q, as he used to call her, what it all meant. I love you too well, she replied, not to hide your anger from the crowd in the courtyard. You perhaps will one day be called to govern all those people. And what would they say if they saw you in such a fit of rage? Do you think they would ever obey you if they knew you were so wicked? Upon which the child asked her pardon and promised never again to give way to such fits of anger. This, observed the emperor, was language very different from that addressed by Monsieur de Villeroy to Louis XV. Behold all those people, my prince, said he. They belong to you. All the men you see yonder are yours. Madame de Montesquieu was adored by the young King of Rome. At the time of her removal from Vienna, it was found necessary to employ stratagems to deceive the child. It was even feared that his health would suffer from the separation. The emperor had conceived many novel ideas relative to the education of the King of Rome. For this important object, he decided on the Institut de Meudon, of which he had already laid down the principle with the view of farther developing it at his leisure. There he proposed to assemble the princes of the imperial house, particularly the sons of those branches of the family who had been raised to foreign thrones. This plan, he contended, would have combined the intentions of private tuition with the advantages of public education. These children, said the emperor, who are destined to occupy different thrones and to govern different nations, would thus have acquired conformity of principles, manners, and ideas, the better to facilitate the amalgamation and uniformity of the federative parts of the empire. Each prince was to bring with him from his own country 10 or 12 youths about his own age, the sons of the first families in this state. What an influence would they not have exercised on their return home? I doubted not, continued the emperor, but that princes of other dynasties and connected with my family would soon have solicited, as a great favor, permission to place their sons in the Institute of Meudon. What advantages would thence have arisen to the nations composing the European Association? All these young princes, said he, would have been brought together early enough to be united in tender and powerful bonds of youthful friendship, and they would, at the same time, have been separated early enough to obviate the fatal effects of rising passions, the ardor of partiality, the ambition of success, the jealousy of love. The emperor wished that the education of the princes should be founded on general information, extended views, summaries, and results. He wished them to possess knowledge rather than learning, judgment rather than attainments. He preferred the application of details to the study of theories. Above all, he objected to the pursuing of any particular study too deeply, for he regarded perfection or too great success in certain things, whether in the arts or sciences, as a disadvantage to a prince. A nation, he said, will never gain much by being governed by a poet, a virtuoso, a naturalist, a chemist, a turner, a locksmith, etc. Maria Louisa confessed to the emperor that when her marriage with him was first proposed, she could not help feeling a kind of terror owing to the accounts she had heard of Napoleon from the individuals of her family. When she mentioned these reports to her uncles, the archdukes, who were very urgent for the marriage, they replied, "That was all very true while he was our enemy, but the case is altered now." To afford an idea of the sympathy and goodwill with which the different members of the Austrian family were taught to regard me, said the emperor, it is sufficient to mention that one of the young archdukes frequently burned his dolls, which he called roasting Napoleon. He afterwards declared that he would not roast me anymore, for he loved me very much, because I had given his sister Louisa plenty of money to buy him playthings. Since my return to Europe, I have had an opportunity of ascertaining the sentiments entertained by the House of Austria towards Napoleon. In Germany, a person of distinction informed me that having had a private audience of the Emperor Francis during his tour of Italy in 1816, the conversation turned on Napoleon. Francis spoke of him in the most respectful terms. One might almost have supposed, said my informant, that he still regarded him as the ruler of France and that he was ignorant of his captivity at St. Helena. He never alluded to him by any other title than the Emperor Napoleon. I learned from him, the same individual, that the Archduke John, when in Italy, visited a rotunda on the ceiling of which was painted a celebrated action of which Napoleon was the hero. He raised his hat to look at the painting. His hat fell off, and one of his attendants stooped to pick it up. "Let it be," said he. "It is thus that the man who is there portrayed should be contemplated." Now that I am on this subject, I will note down a few particulars which I collected in Germany since my return to Europe, and mark the degree of credit to which they are entitled. I may mention that I obtained them from individuals holding high diplomatic posts. Everyone knows that these members of the diplomatic corps form amongst themselves a sort of family, a kind of Freemasonry, and that their sources of information are of the most authentic kind. The Empress Maria Louisa complained that when she quitted France, M. de Talleyrand reserved to himself the honor of demanding from her the restitution of the crown jewels and ascertaining whether they had been restored with the most scrupulous exactness. In 1814, during the disasters of France, many tempting and brilliant proposals were made to Prince Eugene. An Austrian general offered him the crown of Italy in the name of the Allies on condition of joining them. This offer afterwards came from a still higher quarter and was several times repeated. During the reign of the emperor, there had been some idea of raising the prince to a throne, and those of Portugal, Naples, and Poland were thought of. In 1815, men of high influence in European diplomacy endeavored to sound his opinions with the view of ascertaining whether, in case Napoleon should again be constrained to abdicate, that the choice should fall on him, he would accept the crown. On this occasion, as on every other, the prince steadily pursued a line of duty and honor which will immortalize him. Honor and fidelity was his constant reply, and posterity will make it his device on the distribution of states. In 1814, the Emperor Alexander, who frequently visited the Empress Josephine at Malmaison, signified a wish to procure for her son the sovereignty of Genoa. She, however, declined this proposition at the instigation of one of the ruling diplomatists who falsely flattered her with the hope of something better. At the Congress of Vienna, the Emperor Alexander, who honored Prince Eugene with particular marks of favor, insisted that he should be made the sovereign of at least 300,000 subjects. He testified the sincerest friendship for him, and they were every day seen walking about together, arm in arm. The landing at Cannes put a period, if not to the sentiment, at least to the manifestation of it, and changed the political interests of the Emperor of Russia. The Austrian government even entertained the idea of seizing the person of Prince Eugene and sending him a prisoner to a fortress in Hungary. But the King of Bavaria, his father-in-law in dignity, represented to the Emperor of Austria that Eugene had gone to Vienna under his protection and guarantee, and that they should not be violated. Thus, Eugene remained free on his own private parole and that of the king, his father-in-law. So late as 1814, gold 20 and 40 franc pieces were struck at Milan with the head of Napoleon and the date of 1814, either for motives of economy or some other cause. No new die has yet been engraved. After the fall of Napoleon, Alexander on several occasions manifested a marked and decided dislike to him. In 1815, he was the promoter of every second crusade against Napoleon. He directed every hostile measure with the utmost degree of animosity and seemed to make it almost a personal affair, alleging as the cause of his aversion that he had been deceived and trifled with. If this tardy resentment was not a mere pretense, there is every reason to believe that it was stirred up by an old confidant of Napoleon, who in private conversation had artfully wounded the vanity of Alexander by statements, true or false, of the private opinion of Napoleon with regard to his illustrious friend. In 1814, there appeared reason to believe that Alexander would not be averse to see young Napoleon placed on the throne of France. After the emperor's second abdication, he seemed far less favorably disposed to the continuance of Napoleon's dynasty. In the Second Crusade, the Emperor Alexander marched at the head of innumerable forces. He was heard to declare at that period that the war might last for 3 years, but that Napoleon would nevertheless be subdued in the end. On the first intelligence of the Battle of Fleurus, the chiefs of all the Russian columns immediately received orders to halt, while all the Austrian and Bavarian corps instantly turned off with the view of detaching themselves and forming a separate force. Had the Congress of Vienna been broken up on the 20th of March, it is almost certain that the crusade would not have been renewed, and had Napoleon been victorious at Waterloo, it is also tolerably certain that the crusade would have been dissolved. The news of Napoleon's landing at Cannes was a thunderbolt to the French plenipotentiary at Vienna. He indeed drew up the famous declaration of the 13th of March, and virulent as it is, the first draft was still more so. It was amended by other ministers, accountants as his plenipotentiary, as he gradually learned the advance of Napoleon was a sort of thermometer, which excited the laughter of all the members of Congress. Austria soon knew the real state of affairs. Her couriers informed her admirably well of all that was passing. The members of the French legation alone were involved in doubt. They were still circulating a magnanimous letter from the king to the other sovereigns, informing them that he was resolved to die at the Tuileries, when it was already known that Louis had left the capital and was on his way to the frontier. A member of the Congress and Lord Wellington, in a confidential conversation with the members of the French legation, with the map in their hands, assigned the 20th and the 21st for Napoleon's entrance into Paris. As Emperor Francis received the official publications from Grenoble and Lyon, he regularly forwarded them to Schönbrunn, to Maria Louisa, to whom they afforded extreme joy. It is very true that at a somewhat later period, an idea was entertained of seizing young Napoleon in order to convey him to France. The French plenipotentiary at length quitted Vienna and proceeded to Frankfurt and Wiesbaden, whence he could more conveniently negotiate either with Ghent or Paris. Never was time serving courier thrown into greater embarrassment and anxiety. The ardor with which he had been inspired on receiving the intelligence of Napoleon's landing at Cannes was very much abated when he heard of the emperor's arrival at Paris, and he entered into an understanding with Fouché that the latter should be his guarantee, with Napoleon pledging himself, on the other hand, to be Fouché's guarantee with the Bourbons. There is good ground for believing that the offers made by this plenipotentiary to the new sovereign went very great lengths indeed, but Napoleon indignantly rejected them, lest, as he said, he should degrade his policy too far. In 1814, before M. de Talleyrand declared himself for the Bourbons, he was for the Regency, in which, however, he himself wished to play the principal part, Events fatal to the Napoleon dynasty prevented this moment of uncertainty from being turned to good account. Everything tends to prove that the result which was at that period adopted was far from being agreeable to the intentions of Austria. That power was duped, betrayed, or at least carried by assault. The fatality attending the military movements was such that the Allies entered Paris without the concurrence of the Austrian cabinet. Alexander's famous declaration against Napoleon Bonaparte and his family was also made without the Austrian power being consulted, and the Comte d'Artois only entered France by contriving to slip in secretly in spite of the orders at the Austrian headquarters where he had been refused passports. It appears that Austria, on the retreat from Moscow, exerted sincere efforts in London for negotiating a peace with Napoleon, but the influence of the Russian cabinet was all-powerful in London, and no proposals for peace were listened to. The armistice of Dresden then arrived, and Austria declared for war. During this interval, the Austrian minister in London could never obtain a hearing. He, however, remained for a considerable time in the English capital and did not leave it until the Allies had reached the heart of France. And Lord Castlereagh hinted at the possibility for a moment that the heroic success of Napoleon might render negotiations indispensable. If this minister had not previously been sent to London, he would have been destined for Paris, and their probably influence might have been brought about a turn of negotiations different from those which arose during his absence between the Tuileries and Vienna. In the height of the crisis, he found himself detained in England as if by force. In his impatience to reach the grand center of negotiations, he quitted his post and proceeded to Holland, braving a violent tempest. No sooner had he arrived on the theater of events than he fell into the hands of Napoleon at Saint-Dizier. But the fate of France was then decided. Though the fact was not yet known at the French headquarters, Alexander was entering Paris. The Austrian minister in London exerted every endeavor to procure a passport to enable him to join his sovereign by passing through Calais and Paris, but in vain. The circumstance, whether accidental or premeditated, was another fatality. But for this disappointment, the Austrian minister would have reached Paris before the Allies would have joined Maria Theresa. Louisa would have defeated the last projects of Monsieur de Talleyrand and would have altogether produced new combinations. Opinion was divided in the Austrian cabinet. One party was for the union of France, the other for the alliance with Russia. Intrigue or chance decided in favor of Russia, and Austria from that moment was merely led on. The 14th. The coffee that was served at our breakfast this morning was better than usual. It was even good. The emperor expressed himself pleased with it. Some moments after, he observed, placing his hand on his stomach, that he felt the benefit of it. It would be difficult to express what were my feelings on hearing this simple remark. The emperor, by thus appreciating so trivial an enjoyment, contrary to his custom, unconsciously proved to me the effect of all the privations he had suffered, but of which he had never complained. When we returned from our evening walk, the emperor read to me a chapter on the provisional consuls, which he had dictated to Monsieur de Montholon. Having finished reading, the emperor took a piece of ribbon and began to tie together the loose sheets of paper. It was late. The silence of night prevailed around us. My reflections were on that day of a melancholy cast. I gazed on the emperor. I looked at those hands which had wielded so many scepters, and which were now tranquilly, and perhaps not without some degree of pleasure, occupied in the humble task of tying together a few sheets of paper. On these sheets, indeed, were traced events that will never be forgotten, portraits that will decide the judgment of posterity. It is the book of life, or death, to many whose names are recorded in it. These were the reflections that passed in my mind. And the emperor, thought I, reads to me what he writes. He familiarly converses with me, asks my opinion, and I freely give it. After all, I am not to be pitied in my exile at St. Helena. The 15th. Immediately after dinner, the emperor walked in his favorite path. He had his coffee carried down to him in the garden, and he drank it as he walked about. The conversation turned on love. I must have made some very fine and sentimental remarks on this important subject, for the emperor laughed at what he styled my prattle, and said that he understood none of my romantic verbiage. Then, speaking with an air of levity, he wished to make me believe that he was better acquainted with sensations than sentiments. I made free to remark that he was trying to be thought worse than he was described to be in the authentic but very secret accounts that were circulated about the palace. And what was said of me, resumed he with an air of gaiety. Sire, replied, it is understood that when in the summit of your power you suffered yourself to be bound in the chains of love, that you became a hero of romance, that fired by an unexpected resistance you conceived an attachment for a lady in private life, that you wrote her above a dozen love letters, and that her power over you prevailed so far as to compel you to disguise yourself and to visit her secretly and alone at her own residence in the heart of Paris. And how came this to be known? Said he, smiling, which of course amounted to an admission of the fact. And it was doubtless added, continued he, that was the most imprudent act of my whole life. For had my mistress proved treacherous, what might not have been my fate, alone and disguised in the circumstance in which I was placed amidst the snares with which I was surrounded? But what more is said of me? Sire, it is affirmed that your majesty's posterity is not confined to the king of Rome. The secret chronicle states that he has 2 elder brothers, one the offspring of a fair foreigner whom you loved in a distant country, the other the fruit of a connection near at hand in the bosom of your own capital. It was asserted that both had been conveyed to Malmaison before our departure, the one brought by his mother and the other introduced by his tutor, and they were described to be the living portraits of their father. The emperor laughed much at the extent of my information, as he termed it, and being now in a merry vein, he began to take a frank retrospect of his early years, relating many of the love affairs and numerous adventures in which he had been engaged. I omit the first. Amongst the second, he mentioned a supper that took place in the neighborhood of the Seine at the commencement of the Revolution, and at which he had been present in the company with the faithful de Mazy. He described the whole with the utmost pleasantry. He had got himself, he observed, into a wasp's nest, where his patriotic eloquence had to contend strenuously against the contrary doctrines of the other guests, and had nearly brought him into some serious scrape. You and I, he continued, were at that time very far from each other. Not so very far in point of distance, sire, I replied, though certainly very remote with respect to doctrines. At that time, I was alone in the neighborhood of the Seine, on one of the quays of Lyon, where crowds of patriots were declaiming against the cannon which they had just discovered in some boats, and which they termed a counter-revolution. I very unopportunely proposed that they should make sure of the cannon by administering to them the civic oath. However, I narrowly escaped being hanged for my folly. You see, sire, that I might precisely at that moment have balanced your account had any disaster befallen you among your aristocrat companions. This was not the only curious coincidence that was mentioned in the course of the evening. The emperor, having related to me an interesting circumstance that took place in 1788, said, "Where were you at that time?" "Sire," replied I, after a few moments' recollection, "I was in Martinique, supping every evening with the future Empress Josephine." A shower of rain came on, and we were obliged to retire from our favorite path, which the emperor observed we might probably, at a future period, look back to with pleasure. "Perhaps so," I replied, "but certainly that will not be until we have forsaken it forever. Meanwhile, we must content ourselves with naming it the path of philosophy, since it cannot be called the path of Lethe." The 16th. Today the emperor put some questions to me relative to the Faubourg Saint-Germain, the last bulwark of the old aristocracy, that refuge of the old-fashioned prejudice, the Germanic League, as he called it. I told him that before his last misfortune, his power had extended into every part of it. It had been invaded, and its name alone remained. It had been shaken and vanquished by glory, and that the victories of Austerlitz and Jena and the triumph of Tilsit had achieved its conquest. The younger portion of the inhabitants, and all who had generous hearts, could not be insensible to the glory of their country. The emperor's marriage with Maria Louisa gave it the last blow. The few malcontents who remained were either those whose ambition had not been gratified, or who are to be found in all classes, or some obstinate old men and silly old women, bewailing their past influence. All reasonable and sensible persons had yielded to the superior talents of the head of the state, and endeavored to console themselves for their losses in the hope of a better prospect for their children. This became the point towards which all of their ideas were directed. They gave the emperor credit for his partiality to old family names. They agreed that anyone else in his place would have annihilated them. They prized very highly the confidence with which the emperor had collected individuals of ancient family about his person, and they valued him no less for the language he had made use of in making choice of their children to serve in the army. These names belong to France and history. I am the guardian of their glory. I will not allow them to perish. These and other such expressions had gained him numbers of proselytes. The emperor here expressed his apprehension that sufficient favor had not been shown to this party. My system of amalgamation, said he, required it. I wished and even directed favors to be conferred on them, but the ministers, who were the great mediators, never properly fulfilled my real intentions in that respect, either because they had not sufficient foresight or because they feared that they might thus create rivals for favor and diminish their own chances. Monsieur de Talleyrand, in particular, always showed great opposition to such a measure and always resisted my favorable intentions towards the old nobility. I observe, however, that the greater part of those whom he had placed near him had soon shown themselves attached to his person, that they had served him conscientiously, and had, generally speaking, remained faithful to him at the critical moment. The emperor did not deny it, and even went so far as to say that the twofold event of the king's return and his own abdication must naturally have had great influence on certain doctrines, and that for his own part he could see a great difference between the same conduct pursued in 1814 and in 1815. And here I must observe that since I have become acquainted with the emperor's character, I have never known him to evince for a single moment the least feeling of anger or animosity against those individuals who had been most to blame in their conduct towards him. He gives no great credit to those who distinguished themselves by their good conduct. They had only done their duty. He is not very indignant against those who acted basely. He partly saw through their characters. They yielded to the impulses of their nature. He speaks of them coolly and without animosity, attributing their conduct in some measures to existing circumstances, which he acknowledged were of a very perplexing nature, and placing the rest to the account of human weakness. Vanity was the ruin of Marmont. Posterity will justly cast a shade upon his character, said he. Yet his heart will be more valued than the memory of his career. The conduct of Augereau was the result of his want of information and the baseness of those who surrounded him, that of Berthier, of his want of spirit, his absolute nullity of character. I remarked that the latter had let slip the best and easiest opportunity of running himself for the ever-illustrious by frankly making his submission to the king and entreating his majesty's permission to withdraw from the world, and mourn in solitude the fate of him who had honored him with the title of his companion in arms and had called him his friend. Yes, said the emperor, even this step, simple as it was beyond his power. His talents, his understanding, said I, had always been a subject of doubt with us. Your majesty's choice, your confidence, your great attachment surprised us exceedingly. To say the truth, replied the emperor, Berthier was not without talent, and I am far from wishing to disavow his merit or my partiality for him, but his talent and merit were special and technical beyond a limited point. He had no mind whatever. And when he was so undecided, I observed that he was notwithstanding full of pretensions and pride in his conduct towards us. Do you think, then, that title of favorite stands for nothing? Said the emperor. I added that he was very harsh and overbearing. And what, said he, my dear Las Casas, is more overbearing than weakness, which feels itself protected by strength? Look at women, for example. Berthier accompanied the emperor in his carriage during his campaigns. As they drove along, the emperor would examine the order book and the report of the positions whence he formed his resolutions, adopted his plans, and arranged the necessary movements. Berthier noted down his directions, and at the first stations they came to, or during the first moments allotted to rest, whether by night or by day, he made out in his turn all the orders and individual details with admirable regularity, precision, and dispatch. This was the kind of duty at which he showed himself always ready and indefatigable. This was the special merit of Berthier, said the emperor. It was most valuable to me. No other talent could have made up for the want of it. I now return to notice some characteristic traits of the emperor. He invariably speaks with perfect coolness, without passion, without prejudice, and without resentment of the events and the persons connected with his life. It is evident that he would be capable of becoming the ally of his most cruel enemy and of living with the man who had done him the greatest wrong. He speaks of his past history as if it had occurred 3 centuries ago. In his recitals and his observations, he speaks the language of past ages. He's like a spirit discoursing in the Elysian fields. His conversations are true dialogues of the dead. He speaks of himself as a third person, noticing the emperor's actions, pointing out the faults with which history may reproach him, and analyzing the reasons and the motives which might be alleged in his justification. He never can excuse himself, he says, by throwing blame on others, since he never followed any but his own decision. He may complain at the worst of false informations, but never bad counsel. He had surrounded himself with the best possible advisors, but he had always adhered to his own opinion, and he was far from repenting of having done so. It is, said he, the indecision and anarchy of agents which produce anarchy and feebleness in results. In order to form a just opinion respecting the faults produced by the sole personal decision of the emperor, it will be necessary to throw into the scale the great actions which he would have been prevented from performing, and the other faults which he would have been induced to commit by those very counsels which he is blamed for not having followed. In viewing the complicated circumstances of his fall, he looks upon things so much in a mass and from so high a point that individuals escape his notice. He never evinces the least symptom of virulence towards those of whom it might be supposed he has the greatest reason to complain. His greatest mark of reprobation, and I have frequent occasion to notice it, is to preserve silence with respect to them whenever they are mentioned in his presence. But how often has he not been heard to restrain the violence and less reserved expressions of those about him? You are not acquainted with men, he has said to us. They are difficult to comprehend if one wishes to be strictly just. Can they understand or explain even their own characters? Almost all those who abandoned me would, had I continued to be prosperous, never perhaps have dreamed of their own defection. There are vices and virtues which depend on circumstances. Our last trials were beyond all human strength. Besides, I was forsaken rather than betrayed. There was more of weakness than perfidy around me. It was the denial of St. Peter. Tears and repentance are probably at hand. And where will you find in the page of history anyone possessing a greater number of friends and partisans? Who was ever more popular and more beloved? Who was ever more ardently and deeply regretted? Here from this very rock, on viewing the present disorders in France, who would not be tempted to say that I still reign there? The kings and princes, my allies, have remained faithful to me to the last. They were carried away by the people in a mass, and those who were around me found themselves enveloped and overwhelmed by an irresistible whirlwind. No, human nature might have appeared in a light still more odious, and I might have had still greater cause of complaint